This opening move, the English opening, is a flexible choice that immediately fights for central control by challenging black's d5 square, and prepares to develop pieces to active squares. This move initiates the Indian defenses, a flexible system aiming to control the center indirectly and develop pieces rapidly before committing the pawns. Developing the knight to c3 supports the d4 pawn and prepares for central pawn expansion, offering flexibility and common transpositions into various English opening or queen's pawn structures. This move prepares to develop the king's bishop and enter the solid territory of the queen's Indian or Nimzo-Indian defense, controlling central squares and creating a flexible pawn structure. This move, 3, nf3, is a standard and flexible response in the English opening, preparing to castle kingside and control central squares while maintaining a solid pawn structure. This move initiates the queen's Indian defense or a similar system, aiming to control the central light squares with the bishop on b7 after developing it along the long diagonal. This move prepares to fianchetto the king's bishop, reinforcing the center and preparing for a potential kingside pawn storm later in the game. The fianchetto of the bishop to b7 now exerts pressure along the long diagonal, aiming towards the center and potentially white's kingside, a common theme in many queen's Indian defense setups. This move develops the bishop to a strong diagonal, supporting the center and preparing kingside castling, typical of the Catalan opening or queen's Indian defense structures. This move continues the fianchetto development, preparing to castle and solidifying the pawn structure while keeping options open for central pawn breaks. Castling kingside completes development and secures the king, preparing to connect the rooks and potentially support a central pawn push. Castling on the kingside achieves essential king safety and connects the rooks, a fundamental strategic goal in this symmetrical English opening setup. White asserts central control, aiming to open lines for the bishops and potentially create a strong pawn center. This move decisively challenges white's central pawn control, aiming to open lines for black's pieces and potentially create an isolated d-pawn for white. This knight maneuver to e5 aims to exchange a piece, disrupt black's central pawn structure, and potentially open lines for white's pieces towards the kingside. This move, na6, prepares to challenge the strong na5 knight with the b4 pawn and potentially redeploy the knight to c5 or b4, aiming to control central squares and create counterplay on the queenside. This move pins the knight on f6, restricting black's development and preparing to exchange this knight if black plays dxc4, thereby gaining central control. Black's move 9, c5 is a sharp and thematic response, seeking to immediately challenge white's central pawn control and open lines for their pieces, particularly the queen's bishop and knight, reminiscent of tactical themes found in the queen's Indian defense. This move prepares to contest the open c-file, potentially supporting a central pawn break or a flank attack, and enhances the rook's defensive capabilities. This move bravely challenges white's knight on e5, aiming to disrupt their central control and potentially open lines for black's pieces. This exchange simplifies black's position by removing a piece that was actively defending the circa 5 pawn and controlling important dark squares, allowing white to potentially exploit the weakened pawn structure in central control. This move recaptures the bishop, centralizes the queen, and prepares to challenge white's control of the d4 square, potentially leading to a pawn structure with an open c-file. This pawn exchange simplifies the position and opens the d-file for white's rooks, creating attacking potential against black's queenside. This move recaptures the pawn and develops the knight to an active square, reinforcing the central tension and preparing to challenge white's control of the d5 square. This knight exchange simplifies the position, removing black's active knight and preparing to advance the queenside pawns. This recapture is strategically sound, resolving the tension in the center and maintaining equality by accepting an even pawn structure, while developing your pieces into active squares. This move initiates an attack on the e4 pawn while simultaneously preparing to reposition the knight for greater influence in the center. This move aggressively contests the central pawn majority and aims to disrupt white's piece coordination, potentially opening lines for black's pieces. This knight retreat repositions the piece to a more central square, aiming to support the d5 pawn and prepare for potential advances on the kingside or a regrouping to attack the c5 pawn. This move prepares to expand on the queenside and potentially challenge white's control of the c-file, aiming to create active piece play. This move prepares to challenge black's central pawn structure by potentially reinforcing the d4 square and eyeing the c-file, while also offering a route for the queen to support future operations. This move, 16, f4, initiates a sharp pawn sacrifice aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and open lines for black's pieces, particularly the bishop on b7 and the knight on a6, towards white's kingside. This pawn capture opens the g-file, creating attacking chances against black's weakened kingside and challenging the central pawn structure. This move boldly sacrifices the pawn to open the f-file for your rook, creating immediate attacking possibilities against white's king and disrupting their pawn structure. This move prepares to develop the queen to a more active square, potentially supporting a central pawn push or creating threats along the c-file and the diagonal. The move 18, qg5 activates the queen aggressively, targeting the g2 bishop and preparing to exploit white's weakened kingside pawn structure after 17, gxf4. This move activates the rook, bringing it to a central file to contest control and prepare for potential future actions like supporting a pawn push or creating pressure on black's queenside. This move activates the rook onto the f-file, directly challenging white's control and preparing for potential exchanges to alleviate black's cramped position. This rook move on the 6th rank aims to exploit the open d-file and create pressure against black's weakened kingside pawn structure, potentially leading to tactical opportunities or a positional advantage. This aggressive sacrifice exploits white's slightly misplaced queen and opens the f-file for black's remaining rook, creating significant attacking potential against the white king. This move initiates a decisive exchange, clearing the f-file for potential counterplay and forcing black to react to the immediate threat against their queen. This move sacrifices the rook to disrupt white's queenside coordination and open lines for black's remaining pieces, aiming to create counterplay against the exposed king. This move shifts the queen to a more active square, preparing to contest the open e-file and potentially support further pressure against black's weakened kingside. The rook returns to f8 to defend the pawn on f4 and prepare for potential exchanges, aiming to simplify the position while maintaining material equality. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, eyeing the pawn on f4 and preparing to support potential threats on the kingside. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, potentially targeting white's king on g3 and preparing for a pawn push on the queenside or a potential exchange sacrifice on d6. This move re-centers the knight, preparing to challenge the black queen and potentially gain initiative on the kingside. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, preparing to challenge white's control of the d-file and potentially targeting weaknesses around white's king. The knight repositions to a more active square on e3, preparing to support potential pawn advances or to contest the d5 square if white decides to push it. The move qh5 is a tactical attempt to exploit the pin on the g2 bishop, aiming to capture it and create dangerous attacking chances on the kingside. This knight repositions to a more active square on g4, aiming to attack black's vulnerable f6 pawn and potentially fork the king and rook if black isn't careful. Black reiterates the queen's position, maintaining pressure on the kingside and preparing to defend against white's central pawn advances. While white has improved their knight placement and activity with recent moves, the knight retreats to e3, consolidating its position after the pawn push and offering a slight respite for white while preparing to potentially redeploy on the kingside or support the d-pawn. This move is a defensive maneuver, repositioning the queen to a safer square and preparing to recapture the pawn on e4 if white captures it. This rook sacrifice on b6 opens up the a-file for white's queen and aims to exploit black's temporarily weakened kingside, forcing concessions. Black's queen retreats to a more active central square, preparing to defend the e4 pawn and potentially initiate counterplay on the queenside with the aid of the rook on f8. This move aims to prevent black's knight from reaching the advantageous g4 square, which would threaten the f2 pawn and potentially create mating threats along the back rank. This move repositions the queen to the active d4 square, eyeing potential tactics and preparing to contest the central files while challenging white's rook on b6. After 29, qd4, 30, kh2 **** comment. * with black's queen aggressively positioned on d4 and threatening further complications. White's king repositioning to kh2 is a prudent defensive maneuver to safeguard the king from potential checks and tactical threats along the open files, preparing for future counterplay. This move creates a vital escape square for the king and prepares to support the queenside pawn push, preventing white from exploiting the weak dark squares. This move is intended to prevent black from creating further tactical threats on the kingside, particularly by clearing the way for the king to potentially escape via the g-file should the need arise, while also preparing to activate the rook on the h-file. This move seeks to exploit the weakened dark squares on white's kingside, particularly targeting the f2 pawn and potentially opening lines for black's remaining queen and bishop. The knight's retreat to g4 aims to reposition for central influence and potentially exploit weaknesses on the kingside, particularly if black's queen cannot adequately defend. This exchange offers an opportunity to exploit the undefended black king by opening lines with the queen, forcing awkward defensive moves. This knight sacrifice opens the h-file, directly threatening the black king and initiating a decisive mating attack by exploiting the exposed position of the black monarch. This move is a desperate attempt to defend the exposed king, but it doesn't resolve the immediate threat of the knight check and subsequent mate. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to exploit the open lines and potential weaknesses in black's kingside after the pawn sacrifice. This pawn push aims to disrupt white's coordination and create immediate threats, potentially opening lines for black's remaining pieces. This rook sacrifice aims to exploit the exposed black king and create a decisive mating attack by clearing the way for white's remaining pieces, particularly the queen and knight. Black recaptures the rook on b7, simplifying the material balance and opening up the possibility for the knight to become more active. This move recaptures the pawn but also allows Black's knight to become very active on b7, potentially creating new threats. This move is a tactical desperation. Black aims to win back material by sacrificing the pawn, but White can simply capture the queen, leading to a decisive material advantage. The king moves to a more active square, centralizing and preparing to support the rook in the endgame. This knight move aims to reposition the piece to a more active square, eyeing potential threats along the diagonal and supporting advances of Black's central pawns in the ensuing endgame. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, eyeing the dangerous pawn on c5 and preparing for potential threats against Black's king. The current position presents Black with a critical decision regarding their queen's placement. Shifting the queen to d4 offers potential counterplay by contesting the open d-file and preparing to support any pawn advances or activate other pieces. But it must be carefully weighed against the danger of White's aggressive knight on g4. This checks the Black king, forcing it to a more vulnerable square and setting up a potential discovered attack or further mating net complications. The king must retreat to the relative safety of the corner to avoid the immediate mating threat on the open diagonal. This move reorganizes White's queen to a more central and active square, preparing for a potential kingside attack while also safeguarding the g5 pawn. This knight move is a positional mistake. It blocks the e-pawn's advance and fails to contest the central control or support any immediate kingside attack. This exchange of bishops removes a key defender from Black's king and opens the g-file for White's rook, potentially leading to mating threats. This recapture is strategically sound, as it removes a dangerous pawn that was threatening to advance further and reinforces the knight on e4, preparing for potential counterplay.